Roche, thanks for joining. And before we get into your work at Smithsonian, I would like you to touch briefly on your background, your film training. I know you have an MFA from Montana State. So talk to us a little bit about how you ended up in Montana.
Yeah, so I ended up in Montana studying science and natural history filmmaking for my graduate degree. After starting in conservation biology, I was working for nonprofits in DC and just felt like that my contribution to the conservation world felt more in the realm of storytelling. And so as I was looking to figure out what sort of path I could take to navigate that, I talked to some folks and decided that that was my best route. And so I was in Montana, pursued my degree there, and then was freelancing for a little bit before moving back to DC to work for Smithsonian. So it's sort of been a circular path, but a really great and interesting one.
Well, you have a very interesting job, and I want to get to that. But first, I do feel like I'd be burying the lead if we didn't talk about the cheetah cam. I stumbled across this early into the stay-at-home orders. It is great watching. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with the cheetah cubs in Front Royal, Virginia.
Yeah, so as Brad mentioned, I work at the Smithsonian National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. So right in the beginning of this quarantine period, we basically were entering a lot of our birth season or birth window for a lot of our animals that we are working on all sorts of conservation programs with. One of the big ones being cheetahs. And so we actually had 4 cubs that were born on a webcam. We had some fast acting colleagues who basically set up this webcam, got the web page built, and basically we've been putting out a ton of cheetah content, and it's doing better than anything else we've done in a while. So it feels nice to contribute to people's relaxing time in whatever form that takes in this period. So yeah, cheetahs have been doing really well. They just got named this week, and so we did an online naming campaign. So that's been a really good way for us to sort of stay engaged with our audience.
The next question, in terms of your content, then, I'm sure there's no shortage, with what you have working through the zoo there. So talk about how you choose your topics. How do you find your stories when you're producing a project?
Sure. So I would say under normal times, it sort of depends a lot on the obvious barriers like funding to get to a place. But a lot of it is really based on what stories are innovative for our research, and then which ones are filmable. So we speak to our scientists a lot about, what are the major actions that are relevant to your research. So we're actually not recreating your research in the field, but instead we're there when you discover what it is that you're looking for. And so that has been sort of our guiding principle for the stories we decide to tell. And that's gone for everything from looking at how elephants are tagged and how that's dealt with in the poaching crisis in Myanmar, to a team of veterinarians who are studying pandemics, to, in this case, coral research that we believe is somewhat positive news. So most of the time we're going into this filming not knowing where the story is going to go, if it is actually a hopeful story or not. But that's been part of the adventure and a good ride for our scientists to start to get used to working with filmmakers.
We'll dig into spawning hope, but before we do, I was interested, turning to the pandemic, how this has affected your work.
So I've spent a lot of time training our keepers who have done wonderful jobs. Obviously, our keepers are still there every day. And so they're filming our animals during their normal routines, and we're working on how to get better footage. And in a lot of cases, that footage, even when I'm back on site, is going to be better than the best produced stuff that I can do, because they're really good quality, intimate moments with these animals that just happen, and the keepers are just there ready to film. So that's been a lot of our content. We put out several videos a week of just keeper submitted footage. And the other way we've been staying busy is really digging into our archive. We have several years of footage that, we put out something on social media and then we move on to the next project. But now going back and trying to make more of it. So we have, really beautiful footage of, hundreds of species that we could just do fun facts about in this time, just to remind people that there's stuff around, and try to turn the zoo as digital as possible, so that you're still sort of getting a visitation experience, even if it isn't the same as seeing it in person.
Well, it was interesting getting ready for this interview, Roche. We looked at some of your previous films, and one in particular uh, dealt with pandemic. I mean, it was literally called Predicting Pandemics. Talk about that project. That you can find that on our website as well to take a look. But what is your perspective on that, looking at it now?
Absolutely. So that was a film project that I think about almost daily at this point, just because of the relevance. And basically, in that story, we were following a team of our scientists. They're veterinarians, and they study basically, how diseases transfer from different forms of wildlife to people. And so they're doing things like testing viruses and trying to identify new ones in bat species, in rats and primates, and then also trying to collect blood samples to do similar tests on the livestock and of the people that are interacting there. And so it was a really good reminder for me to think about often, but at the time it was a big learning curve for me, just to see how easy this can happen. These people are going about their daily lives. Some of these sites are Buddhist, temples that are situated in these old caves that people are walking barefoot because of the cultural sort of affiliation with temples. And so it's trying to figure out how you can work with that and make it a safer experience without being culturally insensitive or something that is not people being malicious to try to extract wildlife in all cases. So it gets really complicated very easily. Things that we do every day, but some of the animals we're doing it with are lower risk than some of the animals that exist in this region. And so in that research, they found several new coronaviruses, none fortunately that were harmful to people. But it just goes to show you how much is out there and how much more research we need to do just to figure out what's there, and from there figure out how we can stop it. So really, really important work, not just to save people, but also those endangered species that are living in these caves that are, by no fault of their own, just kind of existing. So really just trying to figure out how our interactions change seems to be the key, rather than assigning blame to wildlife. And that in turn will hopefully include protecting a lot of these areas.
So your most one of your most recent projects, Spawning Hope, it took you to the Caribbean. Talk about that project and talk about your takeaways working with those scientists there.
Sure. So Spawning Hope, follows a group of scientists who are working with this endangered coral species that has very little genetic diversity in Florida and other parts of the Caribbean. So we went to Curacao, where there's still relatively healthy populations of that coral there. And we have the scientist who's doing really amazing work with cryogenics, and basically has frozen samples of coral sperm from different areas in different periods of time. And she's taking these Curacao populations and breeding them with these frozen samples to see if we can reinfuse some of the lost genetics into populations in Florida, for example. So it's still really preliminary, but it's really exciting to know that can work. It's another huge tool in the in conservationists' attempt to save coral, which, as we know, can be a very dire subject, but is very amazing when it's hopeful. It was a great experience to work on it because I was surrounded by coral scientists who, as depressed as I can feel about coral, they spend their whole life on it, and they were not depressed. They were very hopeful and excited to figure out, okay, there's a lot of challenges here, but what are the tools we can use? And a lot of it is based off of, human fertility research that we do. So it's just, a huge leap in the application, but a really logical way that we can help coral as it goes through the number of changes that they're going to face in the next coming years.
In turning also to the production of this, I thought when we were talking the other day, you pointed out the importance of really respecting their research as you're filming. Talk about the impact that you potentially pose as you're filming, and how do you navigate that, some of the challenges involved with filming something like this and not getting in the way.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, when we started this project, our scientists were very clear that they didn't actually want us going in the water. They were like, you can film the lab parts, we can do interviews. And I was like, can't really do a coral film without being able to see them and see that work, just because that's so much of communicating what coral are and why it's important. And so we spent a lot of time reading research that the scientists had sent us. So trying to do everything we can to understand their research, but then also considering that they're live animals. We were around these animals. They were all night dives, and they, they spawn at very specific hours under very specific circumstances. And so even artificial lights can be a big problem. It could impact whether or not the coral even spawn that year, because they only do it once or twice a year. So if you impact it during that 45-minute window, then that's it. So, knowing that the film process can harm the animals is also something that we had to be very careful of. So we kept the crew very small. It was me and one other person, but then also, trying to film with red lights, just to be aware that they can perceive light, and they need moonlight as cues. So just trying to figure out, the best way that we can still mimic their natural environment while still also filming underwater at night. So that was definitely a big challenge, but yeah, I mean, ultimately the story is what is king here. And I think, it was great to get to film it in any circumstance. And so we were lucky to get the footage we got, and yeah, hopefully that translates.
And also, for those of us who have not ventured into the water with a camera, I would love to hear what a typical underwater shoot looks like. What is the procedure? What equipment are you using? Talk to us about that as well.
Sure. So in this case, most of our underwater filmmaking was done by an underwater cinematographer, Stephanie Gordon. She's really wonderful, and very easy to work with for the scientist, and is very respectful. So that went a long way. But I think a big part of the challenge is, being able to communicate when scientists are stressed underwater. They're paying attention very closely to what they're doing, and so everything that we're doing is distracting to them. So that was one of the bigger challenges. But on the flip side, one of the things that was really nice was, for many of us who mostly film on land, it was nice to be silent and to observe and pay attention to your surroundings and float to where you need to go, rather than than needing to have a dolly shot, or just being able to move around in a 3D space. For underwater cinematographers is a no-brainer, but I think for a lot of us that work on land is sort of a novel experience of filming, and something that I enjoyed immensely.
Well, Roche, do you have any upcoming projects, or where can people find a lot of the content that you are creating right now?
Sure. So pretty much everything we're doing gets posted to the National Zoo's website, so nationalzoo.si.edu. And so from there's, a ton of links out to our YouTube channels and different pages we've built surrounding some of these projects. And so we have currently, one of the larger projects I'm working on is on our research at the American Prairie Reserve in Montana. We have some postdocs that live out there, and they're doing really, novel research with bison and with long-billed curlews, and doing all sorts of acoustic monitoring and really cool research. And so we've been spending the last couple years following them, trying to figure out how we can tell some of their stories a little bit more in a much more accessible way at the zoo. So we're looking at, how do we build exhibits around some of this content? So in addition to the website, hopefully a lot of this stuff will start popping up around the zoo physically once we start reopening.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brad.